Okay, so we're recording. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to give a couple of more seconds because we're right at 1 o'clock and we want to make sure we allow everybody to, log on. It's after lunch, so sometimes people need an extra minute or so. So we're just going to give it another few seconds. But in the meantime, though, for those of you who are here, thank you for joining us. And of course, you'll hear me say that again, because I'm looking at the clock, just giving time for people to log on. We had a great number of people to register today for this very important topic. So we want to give people time to log on. Oh, and I see people are using the chat. That was going to be one of my housekeeping announcements, but I see people are already ready to go and saying, thank you, hi, we're here, and letting us know where you're from. So let's keep it coming. So, okay, good. And the chat is a good indication that people have logged on. So we're going to go ahead and start. So let's make sure you're at the right place. Look on your screen. So of course you're at Centering Racial Equity in the Work to End Homelessness, Aligning Vision with Practice at the Systems Level. And that's something that we definitely want to do. We talk a lot about racial equity, right? But we really want to see it put into practice. Like, how do we carry that out? What does that look like? So we'll be talking about all of that today. So we're going to go to the next slide because, of course, at the start of a webinar, you see that welcome housekeeping. So let's go there. And I just have a few housekeeping tips. And of course, I guess I don't have to tell you so much about the chat box because you all are using it now, which is great. So we want to see that great conversation. Let us know what you're thinking. So that will all go in the chat. Now, if you have questions, I want you to use that Q&A tab because that's what I'll be moderating. And although there are quite a few of you that's tuned in for the webinar, I'm going to try to get in as many questions as I possibly can. So remember, the discussions and the conversations in the chat, and try to put the questions in the Q&A so that we make sure that I don't miss them. And one of the big questions that we always get about the webinars is, will this session be recorded and will the slides be available? So yes. So you'll have access to both. Okay, so we're good there. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want to say that I gave the title at the opening that this discussion is actually a part of the series. So you know where you are at now. So you see our webinar, but what I want to just flag right quick, because we are having these important conversations. So on June 23rd, and we're going to put the link in the chat so you'll see more information about that. We're going to talk about people with lived experience, including people with lived experience in COC decision-making. So you don't want to miss that. So make sure you tune into that. And remember, the link is going to be in the chat. So watch out for that. Okay, and so let's go to the next slide, because I mentioned that this is a system series. And so we put some bullet points, right? Why do the system series? So one of the things that I think I'll highlight instead of go through the bullets is that we do this for the exchanges and the learning. I mean, we really focus on, how is it that we can improve upon our homelessness system response or our homelessness response? And hopefully you'll hear and learn about some good things today. I mean, that's our aim, right? How can we improve upon the work that we're doing? And obviously, centering racial equity is very important. So let's get to today's speakers. So hi, I'm Shawn Crawford. I'm the Chief Equity Officer. I was on the beginning page. So I'm going to be the facilitator, the moderator today. And so first up, so the list is a little different. I think Michelle Carver is going to speak first. But anyway, we have two great dynamic speakers. And so I have to read to make sure I get Michelle's title correct. Oh, it's up there. You see the Associate Director, Homeless and Special Needs Housing, Virginia, the Department of Housing and Community Development, And then we have Dr. Lecia Adams Kellum, and she is the president and CEO of St. Joseph Center, both key partners, and they are both members of our core group of our Racial Equity Network, and they have helped us think a lot about racial equity. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but hopefully you'll hear some useful information today. And I'm sure you will from them, because they've put a lot of work into this. And so lastly, too, I want to thank, I don't want to move on without thanking her. I'd like to thank Christy, and she is the director of our capacity building team, and she's helped us pull this together, the series together. And she's the one flipping the slides, and she'll be making sure that we don't have any technical issues. So we want to make sure that we give a big shout out to her. So let's get to the important topic. So before I begin, I want to explain why we developed this subject. And it's interesting, because with COVID, obviously, Congress, a lot of funding came down the pipeline. So we had housing vouchers. And I know for us as an organization, we said things like, and make sure you center racial equity. We've been saying that for a while. And then obviously a lot of people are saying that. But, I thought about it, and I'm not sure if people really know what that means. So obviously there are a lot of people, community COCs, who have been working on racial equity, but then there are a lot of people in the field that quite frankly haven't. And so what's a start? What are things that people could practically do? How can we look at this and approach this? And so these are just some of the questions that we'd like to explore today, but I just kind of wanted to give you a background on how, we came about this topic. So without further ado, enough of me, let's get into the learning and exchanges. I'm going to kick it over to Nichelle Carver. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So before I start, I just want to give a shout out to all of my brothers and sisters out there who are in the middle of closing out their fiscal year. I am too. I feel you. We're going to make it through this like we always do. So I just wanted to say that first to start, because I recognize June sucks. Anyway, my name is Nichelle Carver. I am the Associate Director of Homeless and Special Needs Housing, as Sean said, at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. I am very humbled to be here today and appreciate this platform to talk about some of the things we did in Virginia, because we were just tired of saying we needed to focus on racial equity, and we felt like we needed to do something. Next slide, please. So before I go into everything, of course, I have to do my due diligence and say that DHCD, this is Virginia DHCD, is committed to creating safe, affordable, and prosperous communities to live, work, and do business in Virginia. And while that just sounds like a statement, actually the team, our homeless and special needs housing team, is very focused on ending homelessness and making sure that people in Virginia are able to get into safe, affordable housing. All right, next slide. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on stats. I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about the inequities that exist. Just wanted to give you this quick picture. I know that it is not binary. It's not just Black folk and white folk in Virginia, but I wanted to show you the stark difference, because European Americans make up 64.9% of Virginia's population, only 29% of the folks experiencing homelessness, while African American Black folks make up 19.9% of Virginia's population. And as you see, there is a disparity where Black folk, I am a Black woman, 32.5%. So this was all based on the 2020 census and the point in time count data. But this is stuff everybody already knows. Like seriously, if you're out there, you know racial disparities exist in our homeless services system, period. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that. I want to talk about what we did in Virginia to try to fix this, because again, I think we got tired of sitting around the table saying it, like we have a problem. And eventually, when you have a problem and you do nothing, you're part of the problem. And so that's where I'm hoping that I can share something that we did in Virginia that you can take back to your communities, or that you're already doing in your community, and you can just enhance it. Next slide. All right, so how do you change your agency's team culture norms, policies, practices to dismantle? I didn't say like fix, dismantle your homeless services system so you can rebuild it with racial equity as a guiding principle. And I meant to say in the beginning, and I apologize, I speak AAVE and GAE fluently. I'm very comfortable. I do not code switch. So when I say ain't, I know exactly what I'm saying. And so do you. That's the thing about AAVE. People understand it. It just doesn't sound like general American English. And so folks think it implies ignorance or something other than it's just a different vernacular. So I wanted to say that just so you understand, when I say ain't, that's purposefully, because that's what I wanted to say in that point. I'm not gonna lie to y'all, this was not something that was easy. We don't have it all figured out, right? But what I'm hoping I can do is kind of give you some of the secret sauce that we use to change who we are as a team, and how the Continuum of Care and the Balanced State local planning groups and other homeless services providers in Virginia use the resources that we were able to provide to change the game. And there are, just for reference, there are 16 COCs in Virginia, with one of those COCs being the Balance of State COC, and that has 12 local planning groups. So when I'm talking about them, I'm talking about the 27. So just so you get that in your framework, in your mind, I didn't want to put it on the slide because, again, didn't want to waste a whole lot of time with that. Next slide, please. All right, so first we started with this principle. You have got to clean your own house first before you tell other people that they are not doing it right. That was by Dan Webster, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it like my big mama used to say it. Big mama used to say, worry about yourself or you start worrying about somebody else, right? And so as we're talking about racial equity, we had to look around the room. And I started out at DHCD 15 years ago on a majority white team. It's not that anybody made a choice to have it majority white. It's just how white supremacy works, right? That's just how it is. And so me, decided that before I can start talking about how the agencies can do this work, I had to look at us as a whole. And because I'm the leader of the team, I bore that responsibility of what are we going to do? And I'm hoping that any leaders out there, you think about your sphere of influence and you change what you can. I work for a state agency, so understand when you start talking about racial equity and you start talking about making decisions of hiring, everybody clams up and gets very worried because they don't want to do anything illegal. But guess what? Our legal system is part of what has created the disparities that we see, right? So let's not focus on, oh my gosh, people are going to look at us a certain way, and let's focus on, we got to get this right. We have screwed up for far too long. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about the remix of the homeless and special needs housing team. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because, again, I work for the state, right? So when you start talking about this on paper, it looks like it's really easy to fix. And when I was writing this, I thought about how difficult it was to even convince folks in HR and those places why we had to do some changing. Like I said, I started out in the unit and it was a predominantly white unit. I was the one Black person when I first started in 2007. And there was an individual who was Native, and she had been there maybe a year, not even a year, a couple of months before me. So that was our team, along with the rest of our team was majority white. We ended up having a young Black woman who started. So then we were starting to look a little more colorful, a little bit. But then when she left and the other woman left, it was back down to just me. And as I moved up, I made the conscious decision that we have to do something different. And I was serving on our diversity, equity, and inclusion team that talked about, our racial equity and our hiring processes. That was in 2015. We're in 2022. And that was a tough conversation because they were like, we don't want to just go out and just hire Black folks. And I was like, but for so long, you've gone out and just hired white folks. Like, I don't understand why, when it's done to try to correct a wrong, that we say it's bad, but when the wrong is happening, nobody cares or pays attention. And so that wasn't within my sphere of influence. And so what I did do is I started saying, well, I want to advertise here and here. And when I felt like it wasn't happening, I took it upon myself to start sending that advertisement out to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, to a bunch of frats and sororities that were out there, part of the D9, saying, hey, do y'all know anybody? If you do, here you go, get them to me. And we also changed the questions on our app, on our application itself. We were asking a lot of things that didn't have anything to do with the actual job. They were just the questions that were always asked. And then within our hiring, our questions started getting more into diversity, equity, inclusion, and how do people feel about it? And so just to give you a little bit of stats about our team, remember I told you what the team looked like in 2007 when I started. Now we have a majority minority team. 50% of our team identifies as members of the LGBTQ AI plus community. We have some Gen X folks. We have some millennials. And mind you, Gen X, I'm sorry, I got to go back and shout out my people, Gen X, because not many of us, but we're there and we are strong. We have millennials, and we have younger millennials and older millennials, and that is two different sets of people. And we try to make sure we're recognizing that. And then we have Gen Z, which I have two Gen Z kids. That kind of happens to be my favorite generation because my kids are like my favorite people. So we have Gen Z. And so you have to think about, our team has so many different perspectives. And so when we start talking about equity, and when we start talking about diversity and talking about inclusion, the thought processes are so different. It's different conversations that we're able to have around the table. And you know what? I just missed something. I have a boomer on my team, and I keep forgetting that this gentleman is a boomer because he feels like an X, feels like a Gen Xer, but he's a boomer. It just hit me. Anyway, our conversations are extremely good because we have such diversity of thought, experiences, and it helps us to think a little bit better. And I'll just give you an example, which I already know y'all know this, but if anybody has seen, Walmart has like some napkins out for Juneteenth, and it says, it's the freedom for me. Like, seriously, it's the freedom for me. What the hell? Like, who was at the table that said, that's a good idea, let's do that? Whoever said that wasn't really part of the culture, probably. And if they were, I don't understand. But the problem is when you have a monochromatic team around the table and folks who don't say, whoa, we can't say that. Like, once you lose that ability to have those folks around the table, you're gonna screw up and say, it's the freedom for me, and have a problem. And so around our table, we have folks that will say, hey, we have folks who have disabilities. And so as we're doing something, they will call out and say, that's real ableist, don't do that. And you have to stop and think, I may not be a person who identifies as this group, but I'm going to listen to the person who does, because that's who I'm out here serving. And so if your team looks one way, it's a bunch of boomers, or it's only X, which I doubt if it's only X because it's only 10 of us that exist in this nation. But if you have a team that has no diversity, fix that, fix it immediately. And it doesn't mean that those folks aren't good. It means you are lacking the tools that you need to be able to look like the people you're serving. People get really uncomfortable with the idea that you need to change, but guess what? You just do. All right, next slide. And I do want to say one thing before I go back to talking about, or before I go into talking about outside assistance. You would be shocked at the amount of times folks came up to me, other leaders in the agency, and said, aren't you worried that somebody's going to say you hire all Black folks or that your whole team is gay? And I was like, no, because I have never gone up to somebody and said, you got a whole team of white, cisgender, heterosexual people, because that's the norm and everybody just thinks that's okay. Well, why wouldn't it be the norm to have a team of people that aren't all the same? And so I was like, I wish somebody would come up to me, and question me in terms of my job and wanting to admonish me or deal with that, because we was going to have a whole problem. But we didn't. Nobody in leadership. They were actually pretty supportive. And we have other teams in the agency that have replicated, trying to have some diversity. And it's actually another Black woman who leads a team. And Sis just went out there and was like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And so I feel like she's battling me to be number one, but it's cool because I'm still the best. And then we have another team that's almost the same way, where she's making sure she has diversity. So it's bleeding into other areas, and it's the right thing to do. Like I told you, Virginia is not 100% white, and the people we serve are not 100% white. So why have we always looked at this as it's white folks and European Americans and everybody else kind of comes in and sprinkles in? Why would we do that? All right, so the thing that we realized when we made the changes, so now we're sitting around the table, this diverse team. Again, I'm talking about it and it seems like it was easy and fast. I became the associate director in 2019. Our team got to the level it is in 2022. And it meant being very intentional with where we advertise, who we interview. Names like Keisha were fine with me. Like, that's the thing. I was looking to find people who might be somebody with lived experience, somebody of color, somebody who had disabilities, somebody who, was a member of LGBTQAI. I was looking for people who had that level of difference. And so after we got the folks around the table, we realized we cannot do this by ourselves. In fact, we're not the right people to do this. And I feel like all too often, because of money, folks say, okay, let's grab this little group of folks and we're going to make them our DEI council. And you do that because it's cheap and you get to say you did it, right? We wanted to make sure we chose somebody who was qualified to do the work that we needed done. And we had a soft launch. And what it was what we about to do some really hard work. So buckle up kind of launch, right? And we met with all of our balance of state, local planning groups and our COCs. And we had this first meeting just talking, like a level setting meeting. And that was in November of 2019. We thought in a couple of months we were going to be able to launch this. And then everybody knows what happened in March of 2020, things changed. So you fast forward to spring 2021, where we put out an RFP looking for a group that could do the work, that understood the need to have equity interwoven into our homeless services system. So we had lots of people put out RFPs for diversity and equity. And then when you sat down with them, they were like, yeah, we'll talk about diversity and equity. We start asking about homeless systems. No idea. So if you didn't have both pieces, we didn't want you to be the ones helping to fix our system, or actually dismantle our system and rebuild it. So in our TA that we acquired, we wanted technical assistance for our unit, like all of us in the team, because one of the things we recognized is we need to learn how to work together as a diverse team, how to be comfortable talking about things, calling each other out. And we wanted to, again, fix your own house before you start fixing everybody else. And then our leadership team, because we went from it being me, the associate director, and one manager, to me, the associate director, and 3 managers. And so we had to learn how to work as a core unit. And I mean, it was something important because we're a diverse group. We needed to figure out how we were going to have some conversations. Then it was our team without the leadership team. So our staff without the 4 leaders, so that they could have some real frank, honest conversations about what they felt with our TA providers. And then it was the entire homeless services system in the Commonwealth. So there were a series of meetings where they did level setting, but then they also talked about some really tough topics regarding race and equity in Virginia in the homeless services system. But see, that's where a lot of people end. They do this and they say, oh, we good, we're finished. And that's just the beginning. Like that really should be your jumping off point. You fix your house, then you find somebody to come help you do the work to get this as a regular part of what you do every day. Next slide, please. All right, so we had something called TA hours. And for some reason, I don't think it was the concept. It wasn't an easy, understandable concept like I think we thought it was, because we were like, we'll have these hours set aside. People just go in and grab some hours and keep it moving. It wasn't quite like that. It was almost like our grantees and some of the orgs felt worried about starting to address racial equity. Like, oh, we're going to see how bad we are. So maybe we don't want to show the state that. And ignore my dog, you know, it is what it is. I don't even pay attention anymore, but if you heard it, I apologize. Technical assistance hours though. And so they were very clear, this organization that we hired, that they wanted to do capacity building for these orgs. They wanted to go in there and build their capacity for, you know, being a system dismantler, for being a disruptor. It wasn't enough to just be like, we want to deal with racial equity. They wanted folks who were going to be able to go somewhere else and talk about how bad this was, you know, how bad our systems are. Then there was also goal setting for action items. So it wasn't just, we're going to talk to you about these things. It was, what are you planning to see at the end of this? What's going to be different? Are you going to hire more people with lived expertise, more people of color? How are you going to serve people better? Are you going to change your messengers when you go out? Because sometimes it's not the message, but the person who delivers it. And then strategizing around the challenges of getting unstuck when you're in the middle of doing this work, because it does get hard. And like I said, we're in the middle of closeout. The last thing I think about when I'm thinking about my numbers is how equitable the state is. But that's why I need a group of people that are also pushing me to not forget racial equity is important. And then reflection about how the work is going and the impact you're having, because it doesn't matter how great you are if nothing is happening. And then they were just helping orgs to really do some work better. They were talking to people, and if y'all are familiar with Southwest Virginia, it's just not really brown or black in Southwest Virginia. And so just helping people understand the disparities that exist, whether or not you get to see a lot of people that look like us or not. And then also helping them, if they said they wanted to change something, helping them put it into practice, actively addressing it. And then they also called it building the muscles. And if you think about things with muscle memory, it becomes a regular part of what you do. My son plays golf. I don't have to talk to him. Nobody has to talk to him about his swing, his stance, because he's been playing for 14 years. So he gets there, and that's a regular part of his life. But he didn't start out as a 6-year-old who did that. He's done that day after day after day after day for years. And so that's how your muscle memory builds up. And so that's what we have to do, is we have to practice it every single day. And I don't know if I'm good on time, so I don't want to, mess up and take away Velicia's time, because she's amazing. Next slide, please. All right, so I just want to tell you, one of the things that we realized is as a state agency, as a funder, we were going to have to start tying some of this money to racial equity work. And we made the technical assistance accessible to all 27 communities with the expectation they were going to use at least our TA or some other TA. Because then when we're in the application, we start asking questions about your racial equity work. What you're doing? How have things changed? And we weren't looking at people against other communities because that's not fair. But we were looking at a community from where they were at one point to where they are now. And we continue to look at each individual community and we expect to see change. We expect to see something different if you're going to continue to get the amount of funding you're receiving in Virginia. And then lastly, next slide, please. Then I just wanted to say what we have now realized is it's incumbent upon us to continue to check on each other. So as a team, we have meetings, we talk about stuff. When all of these brutal killings have happened around the country, we talk about it, even though it has nothing to do with homeless services. If we're truly trying to have equity and understanding into our team, we have to talk about what it feels like to each of us. And so we have meetings. We're a state agency with a bunch of rebels that refuse to follow some state policies in terms of, normally folks are quiet about that. We talk about it so we can build stronger, better relationships. But then we also talk about it so we can help our COCs do the same. And so I'll just, use a couple of examples of the momentum. Our Balance of State COC manager and her team, they work really closely with the LPGs, the local planning groups. So they do a lot of capacity building, but they also have equity committee that is made up and pretty much led by leaders of the local planning groups. We also make sure that the leaders in those different COCs are fostering spaces, just like I'm doing, where the conversations can happen, because that's how you keep really good people. That's how you normalize talking about race and equity. And that's how you make it a part of who you are and not something separate. So with that, again, I appreciate the time to speak with everyone. Next slide. That is my information, and I will turn it over to Dr. Adams Kellum.
Oh, hi. Before Dr. Kellum speaks, I want to just say something briefly, and this is Sean again. I want to be clear that everyone understands why we started with getting your house in order, right? Because I can say for us from the Alliance, we've done a great job in creating external tools. So I talked about our racial equity network. And so we've talked about, things like looking at your data. But when it comes to us standing out in front and saying how we've been complicit in advancing inequity externally in terms of whose voices we elevate at our conference, who we elevate to leadership positions, our history. Now, see, that's a different conversation. And the question that we want everyone to think about today, and even my input today, would I have more to say? How much more effective would we be as an organization if we address those issues in our own house and we're able to come together and to think around these issues? And so it's very important to get your house together, as opposed to, oh yes, we'll look at our data, we'll do all these things. Just think about how effective you would be if you could really center and get the team, the staff, the organization on board, have an understanding. So although we hosted this webinar, we are not an organization in perfection, and this is something that we are working on ourselves. So I want people to understand why we started there and the connection to really developing all of these tools, right? And talking about coordinated entry and how are we going to use these emergency housing vouchers. It can't be on the surface. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Lecia Adams Kellum. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Nichelle. I was forgetting that I was off camera because I was laughing, I was crying, I was high-fiving over here, and I was like, oh, good, they can't see me. So it's an honor to be a part of this panel, and as you have all said in the chat, Nichelle is amazing. And, can you just imagine what we just heard, that a state level organization is holding continuums of care accountable for making sure we're leaning into racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, I'm amazed and I am totally inspired. Next slide. So, as you heard, my name is Dr. Lecia Adams Kellum, and I'm the president and CEO of St. Joseph Center. We are in California. In fact, we are right outside of the Los Angeles area in an area we call Venice. We have services throughout LA County and also in the city of LA. So we span a pretty large area within Los Angeles and the Southern California area. St. Joseph Center's mission is to provide working poor families, as well as homeless men, women, and children of all ages with the inner resources and tools to become productive, stable, and self-supporting members of the community. We have four main, next slide, please, four main pillars of service: outreach and engagement, housing, mental health, and education and vocational services. And so you see here in this slide, just an example of the work that we do, and serving about 15,000 people annually. Next slide. So as you heard from Nichelle, next slide, we all know that there are racial disparities. We've come from a place of being very race neutral, as you know, in our sector. Big 10, talking about homelessness can happen to anyone, knowing that's not true, knowing when I say it could be my mom or your mom, the fact of the matter is, for my white colleagues, it's less likely for it to be their mom that experiences homelessness than my mom, my auntie, my uncle, my brother. And I think when we started to really talk about racial disparities and run the numbers and see in this slide, where white people make up 61% of the United States, and yet 48% of those are homeless. And we see for Black folks, we're 12% of the general population, 24% of us are in deep poverty, and almost 40% homeless. That disparity must be called out because it must inform our work and our practice. And as Nichelle said, getting our own houses in order. Next slide. Well, LA has a huge homelessness problem and crisis. I'm sure you've heard it because this is making national news, that the city of Los Angeles has about 46,000 people who are unhoused. And in the county of Los Angeles, we have 66,000. And sadly, these 2020 results show for the county of LA, that's about a 12% of increase in homelessness. And for, I'm sorry, let me say that differently. For the county of LA, that's 12% increase. And for the city of LA, that's about a 16% increase. And what's also important to know is that the vast majority of our homeless population are unsheltered. And so that really makes this crisis even worse. It's why you're hearing about our massive encampments, what happened on Venice Beach when my agency housed all the people out of those encampments that were on Venice Beach last summer and housed over 213 people. Next slide. So what you see at the state levels that you saw in Virginia, you see it in the state of California, you heard about it across the United States. It's also the case in Los Angeles, where Black people make up only 8% of the general population and 34% of those who are unhoused. And as you can see in this slide, the disproportionality of Black people is profound and severe in LA. Next slide. And you can see why a race-neutral policy planning and big tent talking about homelessness and chronicity without calling out race and racism means we're never going to get to the heart of the problem of why people are unhoused. So I want to talk a little bit about how we in LA addressed homelessness and are addressing it and are addressing the disproportionality. But the one thing we had to do with our COC, and we thank LAHSA, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is our local COC, really pulling us together as a committee, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, the Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness, but where we had to push them and what we have to do, and that's why I love Michelle saying, hey, they're pushing from the inside out. All of us have to push from the outside in for change as well, is that as a committee, we really had to call out, it's really some of the first times we talked about in LA, is that the homeless problem is due to structural racism. It's racism in America that is causing the overrepresentation, okay? And this is what we have to lean into and understand in all of our systems, employment, healthcare, and so forth. So next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness, many of us were called together and many of us were actually complicit, because had we been talking enough about race, had we been bringing enough of our experiences of racism in the system that we work within and bringing that to light? And the answer is no. Issues of safety, issues of comfort, and as my mom would say, just keeping your good job. But there comes a time when you have to put all that aside. You can't worry about losing your job. You can't worry about whether your white friends keep inviting you to lunch or to the retreat. You can't worry about, are you the Black girl that makes everybody feel better? You just can't afford to be that anymore when you see so many Black people dying on the streets every day, everywhere. So I was happy to be invited to this space. I was emotional. We were all very emotional in our first few meetings. We were crying, we were hurting, we were embarrassed if we didn't speak up the way we should have, when we should have pushed back on these race neutral initiatives. And we got to work. We were called together to address the persistent overrepresentation of Black people among the homeless. And we wanted to have an impact. We were called together in April of 2018, and we did examine, as we were called to do, the factors contributing to that overrepresentation, racism, identifying opportunities to increase racial equity in our system, and developing some recommendations. Next slide. We came up with 67 recommendations. Y'all, when a whole bunch of Black people get together and we bring all that hurt and all that pain and all that disparity truth, where do you start? Where does it end? We were happy to get to 67 recommendations. It started out with twice that many. And it basically looked at the cross-system collaboration, which is so important to address overrepresentation of Black people, data and research, and the failings that we see across all systems, the importance of funding and the lack of funding that we see in some of our hardest hit communities, particularly Black communities and areas where there's an overrepresentation, profound increase of Black people who are unhoused. Hiring and training needs were so important. Programs and services and quality across systems, and policy and advocacy. And we will put, somebody asked about the details, and we will put a link to this report in the chat. Next slide. So we had some global insights, and I'm going to drill down, but basically we as service providers had to address the fact that there was overrepresentation. We are front and center, the first to see who's coming through our doors. We know it's Black and brown people. So why are we ignoring that and not addressing that? We need to address the impact of institutional racism. We have to call out racism in homelessness, and we have to be clear and honest about what it will take to really address this massive issue. We had to identify opportunities to increase racial equity, and who does the work matters. Who is in leadership matters. This particular project was truly called out by Margaret Lee Thomas, an African-American person who was on the board of supervisors, and he said it was important. So who is in leadership, who we vote for, who's in the job, who's in the seat, who calls the shots, like Nichelle, matters, like Sean, matters. And then we had to really lean into this racial equity lens, and we had to do more than just putting people in seats and call it a racial equity and diversity committee. We got to talk about what's after the table, because people are so tired of coming to luncheons and meetings or being on Zoom talking about the same thing year after year after year. Next slide. So drilling down, we talked about including Black people with lived experience at the table, in systems of care, in research and data analysis, on our boards, running programs, running agencies, having voice. The quality we found of some interim housing programs were not sufficient, and some places where Black people were not thriving. They were not being valued in the way that they felt they should, and there were components of those programs that we leaned into. The rates of return to homelessness are higher, and were higher and seen higher among Black people than other racial groups, despite the fact that there was perhaps equal placement through the coordinated entry system into permanent housing. There was something wrong there. Next slide. We realize we need to build capacity. I mean, we always hear about that, but I try to tell some of these foundations, listen, don't just come to us saying, do you need capacity? Ask us first, because for me, I was like, we don't need more capacity money. We need money to get to work. So there has to be an assessment among philanthropy that says, where are you in the process? Are you at the beginning where you need capacity, or are you ready to roll? And I think that investment needs to be paired with where people and where agencies are in their process. Definitely needed more racially equitable policies, programs, funding, making sure that there's funding going into the areas and agencies that may be smaller, may have less capacity, but are serving the most vulnerable Black people. Black-led, BIPOC-led organizations need investment. And then implementing those targeted improvements that we were beginning to see. Next slide. So, what did we do? I mean, the first thing you have to understand is all of us in that committee, when we launched our report and we were out talking about it, I mean, the one thing we felt was responsible. We have been interviewing people, talking to folks for almost a year. Now we need results. And, you know, there was like conversation about, okay, is it time to shut it down? What do you do next? But all of us just knew that if we didn't stay on task and focus, we wouldn't be able to really see impact. And Commissioner Wagner, Jacqueline Wagner, was able to go to some of the foundations to raise money just to say, look, we need more help on recommendation implementation. We know that the first thing folks will do is say, okay, we had the committee, we had the report, and go on to the next group. No. That's not how we're going to make a difference on a system level. We need to recommend the next steps, which are implementation and hold folks accountable. Next slide. So one of the things that we saw was needed was to embed this work and committee into a county system. And for us, that's where the funding is, and that's where a lot of the infrastructure is. So we moved from being that ad hoc committee to more of a standing committee within the county under what's called the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Group, which got created after this Black report was released. So you start to hear that, yeah, we are talking to people, we are pushing folks, and we are beginning to say we need to see system change. And one of the changes was, again, the creation of this department within the county. And then we have like a 15-member committee, which is always pushing and has lived experts on who are saying, we are holding you accountable. We want to see change. We want it measurable. And I'm so grateful to the leadership at RD for really digging in, because many of those folks are folks with lived experience who have been very upfront about what we want to see change. And so that's really important. Next slide. And this slide, I want to move forward, just kind of tells you the areas that we're going to be working on, and we're going to expand from our 15 core group to 25 to 35 additional sector leaders, just to make sure that the ideas penetrate. It's really important that you're not just sitting in small, tight boardrooms and tables where stuff doesn't go out and proliferate and get implemented broadly. So we're looking again at some of those areas out of the report about cross-agency coordination and collaboration. We're looking at the youth homelessness issue. We want to call out prevention, calling out the coordinated entry system. Oh no, did we really say we're going to call out the coordinated entry system? Yes. And of course, justice involvement and reentry. And I'm bringing that up because next slide, we really did have to call out the coordinated entry system. Black people who were being interviewed, who were answering our surveys were saying, look, we don't feel seen by the coordinated entry system. We don't believe that it measures our vulnerability. And we know that to be true. And I often say, you could see a lady who's been a Black lady who's been homeless for years, 20 years on a corner. And when I pass by her and I say, hi, ma'am, and how you doing? She's gonna say, I'm fine, baby. And look, if she has anything to offer, she gonna offer me whatever she has, okay? And you would never think that she's been homeless for 20 years. And so the vulnerability that gets picked up in these instruments just isn't sufficient to track how Black people show up vulnerable, because we've always been taught to suppress our vulnerability and to underreport. Next slide. So LASA, as I said, is a continuum of care and oversees coordinated entry system. And all of these systems are important to look at because it's how people get allocated to these various programs, access centers, outreach, problem solving, interim. So look, you're not going to be able to help Black people if we're using a gate that doesn't really address our needs appropriately. Next slide. So there is a project underway called the Coordinated Entry Triage Tool Research and Refinement project. There are Black people lived experience involved. There are Black researchers involved in this. There is a lot of really great work around just looking at the tool, maybe reducing some of the numbers of questions in the tool, making sure that it is normed to Black people. And we're not saying, and you could have heard the people saying, oh, we have to measure and we have to enumerate and we have to have a system that looks at vulnerability and make sure that we're serving the right people and all of that. And CES is all about making sure there's proper access and the right people getting served and allocated to the right resource. We don't disagree with that. But a tool that doesn't understand how Black people function and how we show up vulnerable is never going to be helpful in addressing the overrepresentation of Black people among the homeless across this country. So we're glad that the creators of the VI-SPDAT are leaning into this and recognizing that some of this has to change. And I so appreciate Ian and others who are saying, look, it's time to be honest and clear about this. So that's what this process is about. Next slide. And there are a number of agencies in LA, St. Joe's being one of them. Many of them, they're partners, they speak at NAEH, they're the best in looking at these issues, and they're a part of the process of saying, how can we make sure our tools are appropriate? Next slide. Oh, and I want to just do a shout out to the Hilton Foundation for being willing to help fund some of this work and really challenging some of the systems, because the Hilton Foundation and Home for Good were really important in building up the coordinated entry system and many of our tools. And so their willingness to say, okay, let's step back. We may have to dismantle some of the things we actually created. I think it's important to give them credit for that, Weingart Foundation and others for all of this. And thank you. Next slide. So we called out the importance of working with lived experts, and Nichelle said, start with your own house. I'm going to talk about how I did it in my own house, how that work really just helped us see in the ad hoc committee, the lived experts that were our colleagues in the process and their voices. And what was so hurtful was hearing how hurt they were, how hurtful the system felt at times, how they felt so silenced and devalued, and how some of the things that we've come up with, they don't exactly agree with. They often believe in housing first, but they may not believe in the way we operationalize housing first. And the way that we are doing some of this work really needs to be reframed and reassessed from a lived expert perspective. So that is another thing that got called out. Next slide. So one of the areas and ways that we know that we are trying to grow training that was called out in the ad hoc committee, and the need for more folks with lived expertise, and they don't all need training. They need to come train us. But one of the really important things was Careers for a Cause is something that also got developed out of the ad hoc committee results and by Mark Ridley Thomas, supervisor at the time, who put his own investment in this work. And St. Joe's was the first to take it on to say, how can we go and partner with community colleges to train and educate folks in the case management and homeless sector work so that they can get jobs, so that they can join us, and particularly reach out to people with lived experience of homelessness or incarceration, both, or drug and alcohol addiction, mental health. So it's an 8-week program. We're really proud of it. As you can see, it teaches the soft skills of client care. You can't teach people empathy when you get it, when you know what it's like to be hungry, when you know what it's like to be a single parent, and you're trying to get to work on time, you don't want to lose your job. I mean, those are the types of people we need doing this work, who get it, who have hearts and understand what it means to struggle and make decisions between the lights and the rent and food. And we work on work readiness tools. They receive $300 a week stipend, because please, we can't have any programs, any tables that don't pay people for their time. Lived experts must be paid for their time. When they're helping us, they must be paid. When they're giving of themselves and their insights, they're experts, and they must be paid as experts. So we help them with job seeking. St. Joe's, as I said, has been at the forefront of this. I believe we've hired at least 5 or 6, maybe 8 of the folks coming out of this program, because you got to practice what you preach. If you're in the training and you say you're a part of it, then hire the people. Next slide. And so again, what's so amazing about this is things like this start as pilots. And if they're good and you collect the data, then you want to expand them. And so that's what we recently did. And the Board of Supervisors have now contributed to this pilot now for the expansion of $2.6 million of American Recovery Act funds to expand this throughout the County of Los Angeles. So we're very happy to see this. And that means more people of color, more Black people doing this work, being trained, and being at the forefront of delivery of services to people who look like them. Next slide. Okay, and Earl is just an example of one of the C4C graduates. He served as a peer specialist at St. Joseph's Center, been a member of our outreach team. He's a person with lived experience of addiction and homelessness, and also incarceration. We've learned a lot from Earl. He's now moving on to another agency where he's moving into a higher level position. And so this is it. And this is another thing. When we start with these folks with lived experience, or we mentor them, we cannot hold them back. We need to promote them either within our own organization, or when they see an opportunity outside of our organization, we need to applaud it. These people do not belong to us. We do not want to hold them back. We want to make sure that people are advancing, and when they see an opportunity and they want to go for it, we need to embrace them and support them. That is really important. Next slide. But I'm mad at Earl for leaving, because I want him to be a manager at St. Joe's. So hopefully we'll be able to steal him back eventually. Next slide. I just wanted to show you what our approach is. When I started as the executive director, now I'm the president and CEO of St. Joseph Center, we were a $6 million organization. We had 100 staff, and 60% of our organization were white people of European descent, et cetera. And very small number of Black people, people of color in leadership. Today, 70% of our agency are people of color out of the 389 staff. 53% of our leadership are people of color out of 30. We should have leadership of about 4 or 5 when I first started. 22% of my board are people of color. There was 1 Black person on my board in 2008 when I started. And 17% of people on my staff are previous justice involved. And many of the people who work for me have spent 15, 20, 30 years in prison. And I welcome them, and I welcome their leadership, their guidance, support, and all that they bring to make us better at St. Joseph Center. I just want to end by also saying we've done salary surveys and we make sure that we are marketable, that we are competitive, because people of color have so much to offer us and they need to be paid their value. I did start a non-match required 403B deposit on behalf of my staff. Brenda Shockley, who works for Mayor Garcetti, is the person who taught me how important it is to do this. She was a long-term executive director in LA and now works as a deputy for Mayor Garcetti. And so for people who work for me, they get 2 to 5% of their annual salary deposited. And no, we do not require them to make a deposit. Sorry for my ring. We're going to ignore that. We have an emergency fund to cover gaps because, as we've seen in the Spark study, people of color have safety net problems, meaning no one in our system has a little extra. Often we're all stretched. So we become that safety net for our staff. Time off, when you start with St. Joe's, you start with 1 month. This work is hard for people of color who are balancing issues at home and community, trying to be that person for everybody and being that person at work. We want to make sure people have a good work-life balance, though we work really, really hard at St. Joe's. And I do offer a sabbatical for my executive team members because I got one and they deserve it as well. I think I have one more slide. And this is just to let you know that we do work with our lived expert groups. We've received funding from the Weingart Foundation, Hilton Foundation, and many others to continue to have lived experts inform the work we're doing at St. Joseph Center. We are not experts. I have lived experts checking me all the time about what I need to make sure I'm doing and making sure I am checking my privilege. And so I just want to say what I'm saying here doesn't mean I have it down. It just says I'm in progress, I'm leaning in, and I'm trying to do a better job. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, I've turned back my video. So I think we're at the Q&A. And so I think Michelle should be on screen too. I only see you, Dr. V, but thank you. And you know what I really appreciated is you both really drilling down on doing the work. And what I didn't want to do, as I alluded to in the middle, well, you'll do this tool and here's the framework. Now we've got some deep digging to do. Oh, my camera isn't on. I'm sorry. See when you let old people work their own gadgets, it's a disaster. So look, I see we have a decent enough time. So everybody, y'all are going to be mad at me. I should have put this to 2:30 because we've got some good questions. We've got some great chats, and I'm not going to be able to get to them all. And I see even more questions came in. So I jotted down a couple of things. And so at least I figure, okay, let's get some good things out the way. But I do want to say that the responses in the chat have been great. This is a great reaffirming conversation for me, for my mental health. It is stressful, and I'm not in the field, and so I really want to give a shout out to people who are in the field. But to even talk about racial equity, someone mentioned in the question, liberation, is stressful because this isn't the job for people of color. It is, but it's also our life and experience. And so I won't be able to ask that question, but I'm going to highlight it because one of the reasons, and it's important for us to understand, in particular, I'll say for myself, why this discussion, and we talk about how do we make sure that we advance equity and uplift, particularly people of color experiencing homelessness, given the disproportionality, because I understand that their liberation is connected to mine. Okay, so we want to be clear about that. So let's get to the question. So sorry, I won't be able to ask the question about liberation. There's a whole great analysis in the Q&A, but I'm going to give a shout out to that point. Very true. So
well, Sean, one thing,
yes.
Someone said, are we hiring? And the answer is yes.
I saw that.
Yes, we are, as a
I was
matter of
gonna
fact.
text you and say, girl, everybody's like, can I now, yeah, now I see what's kind of, now, y'all know you're gonna have to move to Los Angeles. Now, I don't even know if some of them
Come on,
folks
y'all, we
who
hiring,
were
come on.
chatting, I looked where they were from, but I don't blame you. I had that same question, V. So look, Michelle, I'm gonna kick it back to you right quick. And there were a lot of questions, so I'm just trying to get at, just so people have some concrete ideas. And look, I think I'm going to, due to time, I'm going to put two of them together, okay? So, Nichelle, so can you give an example? Like you talked about, you eliminated some of the questions that were on applications that, you know, in retrospect, really didn't add to the job. You really didn't need to ask those for the position. And so they were irrelevant to the job. So someone asked, like, so could you kind of give an example? I guess as people are thinking through, like, what was it that you saw that you were like, if you could give an example of that. And then also, if you could talk about some of the non-traditional places that you use to advertise and really get the diverse candidates.
Okay, so I'll give you an example of a question that I think all of us ask, and it's like, tell us about your education and experience, right? Very generic and truly doesn't tell what we really need to know. So instead, especially education, because we know that the system is extremely biased, and typically if you don't have money, it's harder to get the education. And so the questions we'll ask that we changed to was, you know, talk to us about your experience working with youth experiencing homelessness. Talk to us about your work working with diverse groups, people with disabilities. So to specifically narrow it down, I don't want to hear, I went here, I did this, I'm this great person. I want to know specifically what was being done in your career. And like, we have a person who comes from New York. She was able to talk about the work she was doing on the streets with folks that were older adults. And that's the kind of stuff that we needed to see. Not that it wasn't great she had her MSW, wonderful. That's not what we needed to make sure we got the right person for the job.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget the second piece, like the advertise.
Okay. I was like, oh, it's the second piece. So if you go to, if you send something out to Idealist, which typically will get people that are trying to work from a space of in their hearts and they want a job that feeds their souls. Also, historically Black colleges and universities. If you have an HBCU in your area, connect with the job folks there and make sure you get on their bulletin boards, make sure you get on their email list. I'm a graduate of Virginia State University, thank you. And HBCUs are important to this work. I can't remember how many of our doctors and lawyers, but majority of Black doctors and lawyers come from HBCUs. Also, you want to send it out. I have the benefit of being part of the Divine Nine, as my soror Lecia is, and reaching out to our contacts and our connects, because those are folks who have also connections to other people of color than the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, because they can get that information out to a lot more folks than I have access to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so V, I'm gonna turn it to you. You talked about the VI SPDAT and biases. Can you delve deeper into that?
Well, one of the things that we heard from the people, because when we ran our ad hoc committee process, we wanted to hear from the people. And people were saying, number one, it was too long. They felt it was invasive. People don't know where that information is going. And it doesn't have enough of an understanding of our cultural practices. Black people don't go around complaining, believe it or not. We don't go around putting our vulnerability out there. We really are super survivors, unfortunately, so resilient. So when you ask questions about mental health and you ask questions about, you know, previous years of like incarceration, or have you been harmed or hit? I mean, Black people underreport stuff like that in general. Now, if you also have a portion of this which has some subjectivity, meaning who is doing the interviewing matters, and the vast majority are white people who don't have experience with people of color, understanding how Black people report, then you can't even support those findings with better insight. So that training is important. Who's doing the analysis is important. So I think about my team of outreach workers made mostly of people of color and people with lived experience. When they're out there on Venice Beach and they're analyzing people and asking questions, they're also saying, you know, what this really means is this. Like, I know you told me you got jumped the other day, you know, when you were coming out. So that's what we're talking about. Translating the experiences, and the instrument wasn't normed on enough Black people with the level of overrepresentation in this country. It's probably been a very helpful tool for us to think about allocation of resources and making sure we pair the right resources with the right people, but it hasn't done enough to address who's really out there homeless and vulnerable.
Okay, thank you. So V, I'm going to ask you two more quick questions, and then Michelle, I'm going to kick it over to you to close it out. So, and I'm going to just put these two together. I think the first one might be a little quicker. So can you explain a little bit of the funding to like support people with lived experience? And then another person had a question about when it comes to hiring, you know, you've got to do all these criminal background checks. And so like, how do you get your agency to move away from that and be open to hiring people and to being diverse?
So when a system is saying they're going to change, we need philanthropy to assist us, you know, because we can be entrepreneurial with foundation dollars. And we are very happy and appreciative of our foundation partners in the LA area who said, yes, we see the report. We've read the report and we want to be a part of the change. And they saw very clearly that lived experts were central to that work and really got that people need to get paid. And it's because a lot of the lived experts have been saying it for years and we have not heard them and we've not listened to them or gave them like a meal card or whatever. And so finally they heard that. And then we had a model to say, okay, we should be paying $25 to $30 an hour. Like some of our staff are getting paid, right? And so Hilton Foundation, Weingart Foundation, Community Foundation, many of them came together and said, yes, and we want to be a part of it. And when we do our train the training, we actually train people to not only be in those spaces to learn, but also to provide insight. And so that's the way. And if anybody needs more information or how we wrote those requests, I'm happy to share it. What I love about being the CEO of St. Joseph Center is I get to help shape policy. And I get to do things that I know many of my white colleagues have done for years that maybe we just didn't know we could do. You can decide whether you're going to use a background check or not. You can decide that you can do the background check, but how you weigh what you get back is really up to your own policies and procedures. There are some areas that we say, you know, of that background or that may not be appropriate for the people we serve or the families we serve. But for the most part, what is a person who has 35 years of incarceration going to do to seat or do something to move us backwards? That person who has been 35 years incarcerated, oftentimes for something that did not align with that type of time, all they can bring is resiliency, respect, understanding, diligence. I mean, that's what I've seen, and it is an honor. So again, we have a lot of control over who we can hire and who we give an opportunity to.
That's right. And I think more applications coming to St. Joseph.
Good. Bring it.
So look, Michelle, you're going to talk about me because this is kind of a tricky question. So we have about a good 2 minutes or so. So let me think of how it was worded in the chat. Oh, I mean, in the Q&A. So diversity is good, but we know that people of color can be influenced by white dominant culture as well and can exhibit those values. And so diversity is great, but how do you kind of counter that, recognize that, kind of deal with that as we're dealing with our internal stuff?
Okay, so I saw that question and I was like,
you did?
Please don't ask me. Okay, so before I answer, I do want to make one correction. There was a supervisor before me, a Black supervisor, who tried her hardest to make it diverse. It just wasn't the right time that that agency was accepting it. And I want to make sure I put that out there because she wrote in the chat and I was like, you know what? I'm sleeping on the people before me. So Joanne did do her job. It was just she was thwarted a little bit. But all right. So here's what I would say. When we had our outside group come in, they told us and taught us how to challenge each other, right? So if I say something wrong or something that's harmful or hurtful, or I am continuing to inject white supremacy into myself, they had us learn how to call each other in, right? And so within our group, I have been called in when I say something that is supportive of white supremacy or white dominant culture, because I am a part of the same system everybody else is, right? Remember, racism is not the shark, it's the water. We are all swimming in the same water. And so for me, it's having somebody be able to call me out and me calling other people out, or in however you want to say it. But if I'm not close to some Black folk at the top somewhere else, number one, I want everybody to understand it is not every Black person's job to fix racism and fix white supremacy. So when I get to know them, I could be like, sister, what you said was a little crazy, you know, and talk about it or challenge it. But I also recognize I have limitations because I am one person. I can see it, recognize it. I probably might spill the tea to somebody else about it. But until I have a relationship, I can't fix that. So I want to say to anybody out there, build relationships so you can call people. If you see people being part of that system, injecting themselves with white supremacy, don't count them out or write them off. Try to befriend them and figure out what's going on. Because if that's their survival technique, then we just need to help them survive in a different way if they want it. But let's not sleep on the fact that people who got to these positions have had to suck up a lot of mess. And I'm not going to sit back and judge somebody who's surviving. I'll help them as best I can.
Sean, can I just say one more
Yeah.
thing? I know we're out of time, but to the white people in power, in leadership, running systems, please don't be divisive and work a strategy for us to fight against each other. Don't pick just one Black person. Don't pick just her for that. Oh, you're the Black person that makes us feel safe, so we're only going to use you, because that also creates tension in our system and causes us to lose sometimes that voice that we must have and that sense of unity, because I'm not about to be pitted against my sister anymore. If you can't have both of us, then you don't have any of us. And we have to start working with that. And white people have a role in that because historically they've picked and choose like who gets the role, who gets to get to the table. And if I'm that person that gets to the table, then the other Black person doesn't get heard. So how about if I give my seat to her? I mean, you're not picking me just because you like me, are you? So we need to really have white people in our system who are allies or whatever it is that we start calling, you know, those folks. Please don't be divisive. Please don't pit us against each other. Don't use those tactics that are embedded in this racist system against us. It hurts.
That's right. And you know what? You're going to have the last word. Y'all can blame this on me. We needed more time. This was excellent. I hope everybody walks away with some good nuggets here. So that's what we wanted to do, kind of dig into the nitty gritty. So thank you very much, both of you. And thank you to all of the attendees. The slides and recording coming soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Michelle. Great working with you.
Wonderful, ladies. As always. Thank you.
As always. See you in DC.
That's right.